Buenas noches. We were riding in the van Thursday night. We had to go out, and I was with Carlos, the local preacher, and I said to someone, Buenos dias, and he kind of laughed, and he said something. Carlos speaks very little English, and I mean like about as much English as I speak Spanish. And so he mumbled something in Spanish and said, he kind of laughed, and then he says, it's Buenas noches. And I knew that already. I was just being silly. I was kind of imitating Buck because he would say Buenos dias to everyone. And so I looked at Carlos and I said, in America, and of course he knew he could understand that. I said, we have a word, palabra. He said, okay. And I said, whatever. And I said, that's noches, dias, whatever. He didn't quite get that, but I was teasing him about that. I said, we can say buenos dias, buenas noches. Americans would just say whatever. Somebody reminded me of this, and I forgot to tell you this morning, but one interesting event, and we'll look at our sermon, but somebody reminded me of this, and I said, I have to tell this tonight. Cindy said she thought I wasn't going to be able to go on this morning when I got talking about Scott drinking the water. So I'm going to tell one humorous thing and then stop before in my delirium from lack of sleep, I get too carried away with that. But we'd had a couple of studies with this one lady and a couple of her daughters that they all lived there together, and this young man from Jackson, Mississippi, Wesley, he was in our team, and so I always stayed with the Spanish-only service because I was counting for them, and people would kind of straggle in late, so I would stay there for the whole service so I could make sure I counted everyone. Well, the service was just getting underway, and I didn't see these ladies that we had invited, and I got telling Wesley, I said, well, they live on down that way, then maybe it would be good if we went to their house, and we invited them, and offer even to walk with them. Tell them we'll walk you down there, we'll walk you home. And maybe that would encourage them to come. And, it was about dark 30, as we say around here. And so I asked one of the translators, I said, you think that's okay as long as I take somebody with me? You think that's safe? He said, yeah, it's a pretty good area. I think you're okay. So we said, all right, let's do it. And I asked Wesley what he thought, and he said, well, I think they would appreciate the gesture if nothing else. So off we go. And we get there, and it's good and dark by the time we get there. And we're about to make the curve around to walk into their little yard area. And Wesley says, Brother Chad? I said, yes, sir. He said, how are we going to communicate with them when we get there? And I looked at him and I said, I don't know. We forgot to take a translator. And that was an experience. Because the mother, the older lady, she took no regard whatsoever for the fact that we did not have a translator. And I mean, she was 90 to nothing. And she's gesturing to the sky and she's gesturing to the ground. I don't know what she said. And I was laughing. It's funny because when you talk to someone, I was talking to Wade Webster about this, and he said he had the same problem when he first started doing some of these trips. You want to say we're trying to invite her, and you tend to go like this. You tend to go, invite church. It's still English. And so that poor lady probably thought I was a complete fool. I'm pretty sure that's what she said to Hainer the next time we went to her house, because she was telling him something in Spanish and he kept laughing. So I'm pretty sure it was us. And I also discovered if you want to make people in Los Campos laugh, just bring me over there and let me say anything in Spanish. Apparently, my southern accent does not translate very well, even the few words that I know. But boy, what a great trip! And I'm sure we'll have a report at some point and talk more about that. But somebody reminded me of that this morning. I said I got to share that with everybody. That's just too funny to pass up on. This is the fourth Sunday, and I was debating as tired as I am and all, and coming in from this trip, but I said, you know what, I'm going to go ahead with the book of the month. It's a short one this month, and so I thought, well, surely if there's ever a good time to do a short book of the month, this is the one. It's the book of Obadiah. This is a very, very short book. It's in fact the shortest book in the Old Testament. But there's a lot packed into it. Let's do as we've often done with some of these others, or as we've done with all of these, and talk about the emphasis of the prophets. I told you, we've looked at this with every single prophet we've studied thus far, but I think it's important just to keep remembering, reminding ourselves, and I'll go ahead and bring these up quickly. Whoops, I went too far. The prophets always point out God's majesty, His holiness, His righteousness, and His justice over and over and over. And I don't have it here on the slide, but they always, as well, close with that ray of hope, that glimmer of hope looking to the coming Messiah. But there always is an emphasis on the holiness, righteousness, justice, and majesty of God Almighty. Now, that having been said, let's look at an outline of Obadiah. This is, it's only 21 verses, so obviously any outline is not going to be that detailed, but there is a vision of Edom's coming, or we could say impending doom. Edom is going to fall utterly. That would be the first 9 verses. 10 through 16 deals with Edom's sins. In other words, this is why they're going to fall. This is why their doom is impending and is going to happen. And then the last few verses, 17 through 21, deal with deliverance in Mount Zion. Judah is going to be delivered, and really specifically in contrast to the fall of Edom. Edom is going to fall utterly, and Judah is going to just continue to ascend, all, of course, working toward the zenith of that is the coming of the Messiah and His redemptive work and the culmination of the scheme of redemption. Another outline, if you want a little bit more detail, there's a judgment upon Edom. You see this in the first 9 verses, as we just mentioned. And that is there's an announcement of this judgment. It makes sure that we understand, Edom understands this is certain. This is not a maybe. It will happen. And then the extent of the judgment. In other words, it is going to be, as we said, utterly. They're going to fall utterly. Then there is the justice of the judgment. They had persecuted Judah. Edom had, that is. They rejoiced over the misfortune of Judah. And now they're going to reap what they have sown. And then there's jubilance in the last section, and that is just to point out that God's elect are going to be victorious. God's elect, they're going to come out winners in the end, not because of something inherent within them, but because they are God's people. They're going to receive covenant blessings, they're going to conquer their enemies, and they're going to reign as the redeemed. Again, that's all ultimately looking toward the Messiah, Jesus. Some general facts about the book. Author, of course, is Obadiah. The name means servant of the Lord or worshiper of the Lord. Some people have it translated as worshiper of the Lord. It's interesting because we know virtually nothing else about Obadiah. There are about 13 different Obadiahs in the Old Testament. He's clearly not any one of those other ones. But we just don't know much about him. I mentioned this already. It's the shortest book in the Old Testament. It's not quoted in the New Testament. The date of the book is very highly debated. Really, there are only 2 different times it could be. One of them would be 586 BC, the destruction of Jerusalem by Babylon. Nebuchadnezzar, 586, 587. Some people even say 585 or so. But this would be one idea. And the idea is here's Edom gloating over Judah's fall to Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians. That's one possibility. The only other possibility will be somewhere around 845 BC when the Philistines and the Arabs attacked Jerusalem. It has to be one of those two because there's this attack on Jerusalem or Judah, and they are defeated. So that really narrows it down to these two. Here's the bottom line. Neither one of these dates is going to damage the message. But I tend to believe, as a lot of others do as well, that the earlier date makes more sense. I know some really good, strong brethren who took the position that it's the destruction of Jerusalem when Nebuchadnezzar came. Johnny Ramsey, he has a little booklet on Obadiah. He took that position. Frank Dunn, that I've used a lot for a lot of these books of the month, he takes that position. or took that position. I don't believe Brother Dunn has passed on now, but I think from looking at some of my class notes, my father-in-law and others, I think there's just it makes a little bit more sense to me that it would be the earlier date. And just a couple of quick things here as to why I would think that way, and others. There's no indication that this destruction that is being discussed in the book, as far as Judah is concerned, is even close to the level of what you see when Nebuchadnezzar comes and in many ways we could say literally levels the city. There's nothing mentioned about the destruction of the temple. That it's hard to imagine this being that event and the temple at least not being mentioned. When the temple was just destroyed. The other prophets almost, in fact, I'm trying to think, but I believe to a man, the other prophets mention it if that's what's under consideration. There's no mention of Babylon. There's no mention of deporting exiles. In fact, the indication is the captives end up going west, not to Babylon. So it seems to me that the earlier date makes more sense. But again, it doesn't affect the message of the book either way. So it's one of those things that it could go either way. The message of the book is that Edom is going to fall because of their pride and because of their very unbrotherly conduct toward their brother, their very close relative, the nation of Judah. They were closely related, of course, because Edom is Esau. The Edomites are descendants, or were descendants, of Esau. Esau was brother to Jacob. The 12 tribes came from Jacob, and so all Israel descends from Jacob. You see how closely related they are. Just looking at a little bit of that history, the rivalry began in the womb. Now, for time's sake, we won't go and look up all these references, but I'll leave them there for you. And as I say, like I always say, if you want my PowerPoint slides or you want these verses to dig a little deeper, I'd be happy to share that with you. But the rivalry began in the womb. Genesis chapter 25, you see them struggling within the womb, and that was sort of prophetic in itself. Esau is being born, and Jacob reaches out and grabs the heel. The name Jacob means supplanter. Not only that, Jacob was chosen as the seed line of the Messiah. Not because Jacob was such a great, inherently better person. Israel could get to thinking that sometimes too, right? That they were some kind of super special people just because, we must be really great because God chose us. How could we be lost? God chose us. And God reminds them often, I didn't choose you because you were the greatest nation, because you were the biggest nation. You were the smallest, the least of all the nations. Well, why did God choose them then? God made a promise to a man named Abraham. In thy seed shall all the families of the earth be blessed. When you get down to Genesis 25 or so, that promise gets even more specific. Jacob and Esau were both descendants of Abraham, but he says specifically it's going to come through the seed line of Jacob. It's not because Jacob was inherently better. That was the choice God made. That's who the Messiah is going to come through. Esau, of course, sold his birthright. He sold his birthright for a bowl of soup, bowl of pottage, we might say. Genesis chapter 25, verses 29 through 34. Brother Johnny Ramsey, in his little booklet on Obadiah, he calls the book of Obadiah, he sums it up as the high price of a bowl of soup. And I think there's something to that, because this really all goes back to Esau selling his birthright. Such a foolish decision that he made just to give it up. After that, Jacob received the blessing of the firstborn, but he did this by trickery, deceit. The Bible does not condone what he did, it records it. And what he did was he deceived his father, Genesis 27. He had the skin, and he had his mother's help. She was also a part of that. And he went and prepared the venison and brought it to him and to receive the blessing. And you know the rest of that story. Esau was furious, and the plan was, I'm going to kill my brother. As soon as my father's dead and the time of mourning is over, I'm going to exact my revenge. But Jacob escaped. He ends up working for his relative Laban, and he marries Leah, and then later Rachel. 7 years and 7 years of work as sort of like we would say kind of something similar to a dowry. And then in Genesis chapter 33, he's coming back home. He's finally broken free from Laban. Laban kept, trying to extend this thing and keep Jacob from going back home and getting to the land where he's supposed to be, where God's going to fulfill that promise. And on the way, some people come back, some of Jacob's people come back and say, there's a group ahead. There's a few hundred men. And by the way, it's Esau and his men, and he's got soldiers. Jacob's very, very afraid, and this is the occasion when he has the dream, and he wrestles with an angel after he had sent some of them ahead. And he sends his people in groups, and he's giving them gifts. And he says, when you get to Esau, give him a gift. We would put it this way: he's trying to butter him up, right? There's one of those southern expressions, Bob. But you've been here long enough. You know about buttering somebody up. But he's trying to butter him up so he can hopefully get himself out of trouble with his brother. And he's worried about this. But a strange thing happens in Genesis 33 when they meet up, and Esau says all is forgiven. And it's a happy family reunion. Kind of one of those situations, if you don't know the end when you're coming to that as you read it in the Bible, it's kind of a tense situation. How's that going to turn out? But it turns out very well. But here's the thing. I started to put this in my slide. I worded it a little differently, but Jacob and Esau met up and they were reconciled, but the descendants of Jacob and the descendants of Esau, they didn't get the memo, apparently, because they hated each other bitterly, pretty much throughout their history. I mean, it was basically constant bickering, fighting, at the very least arguing, if not outright warfare. You have Edom in the book of Numbers 14. They refused to let Israel pass. They said, if you come through here, I'm going to attack you. And so they had to go around, make a big, long detour, all because Edom said, you're not passing through my land. Moses says, we're not going to take anything. We're not going to turn off to the right hand or to the left. We're going to go straight through. And if we even so much as take a drink of water, we'll repay you. And Edom says, nope. You come through here, you better be prepared to fight. And so they had to go around. And God says that would be remembered because they mistreated their brother. David conquered the Edomites, brought them under his subjection, under his rule. 2 Samuel chapter 8. Then later on, Edom is going to revolt, and they're going to gain their independence. This happens way on over in 2 Kings. They revolt and they gain their independence, and some of this is to do with Solomon because of his affinity with idolatrous wives. And so God is punishing him. But there's a city mentioned in here, Teman, and in the book of Obadiah, Petra, however you want to pronounce that, is not specifically mentioned in the book, but is clearly referenced in the first few verses. But these two cities they were flourishing cities of Edom. Petra was located on a trade route. It meant that just means you had to go through it to go to many different places. So it received a lot of business and a lot of traffic, and so it was a very prosperous city. And it was very nearly impregnable. It had some of the best natural defense that could possibly have been hoped for a city. And it's how they lasted as long as they did. They did have great natural defenses, but instead of saying, wow, God has really blessed us with this location where we are able to defend ourselves so well, instead of having that kind of mentality, they had the idea of, well, nobody can conquer us. We've just got ourselves the perfect location here. Nobody's going to be able to take us down. That pride. Somewhere around the 4th century, the Nabateans conquer Edom. Petra falls. The Edomites settle in southern part of Europe. They become known as Idumeans. Later on, around 120 BC or so, John Hyrcanus, and you can read about this in the apocryphal books of the Maccabees. John Hyrcanus conquered the Idumeans, forced them to be circumcised, and incorporated them into Judah. When you get to your New Testament, you read about a fellow named Herod. There were several Herods in the New Testament. These were their descendants. They were Idumeans. In the Jewish wars of AD 67 to 73, the Idumeans were conquered by the Romans. And specifically, of course, you're familiar with AD 70, Jerusalem was leveled. And in all of that, the Idumeans were conquered by the Romans, and they vanished from history, thus fulfilling God's prophecy through Obadiah that they would be utterly destroyed from the face of the earth. There are no Idumeans, there are no Edomites to this day. They're gone. They have vanished, just as God prophesied through Obadiah. Some lessons that we learn from the book of Obadiah. There are a lot of lessons in here, several that we could look at, and I picked out some major lessons that we could look at. I think one lesson that stands out, we've already kind of touched on it, is that pride goes before a fall. Notice what he says. It starts off in verse 1 saying it's the vision of Obadiah. We've heard a rumor from the Lord. He says, verse 2, I've made thee small among the heathen. Thou art greatly despised. But look at verse 3. The pride of thine heart hath deceived thee. Thou that dwellest in the clefts of the rock, whose habitation is high, that saith in his heart, who shall bring me down to the ground? Though thou exalt thyself as the eagle, and though thou set thy nest among the stars, thence will I bring thee down, saith the Lord. Go over to the book of Proverbs. We'll look at a few different verses there. But Proverbs 16:18, we know it. Pride goeth before destruction, and an haughty spirit before a fall. Proverbs 21, verse 4, a high look and a proud heart and the plowing of the wicked is sin. God just does not tolerate pride. And pride is such a problem. It's not a new problem, and yet I sometimes look around and I think it seems like it might very well be as big a problem as it's ever been. It's so easy for people to get filled with pride, especially when we're blessed by God. If we're not careful, we can start thinking, I'm doing pretty well, as Nebuchadnezzar did in chapter 4 of the book of Daniel. And he started thinking, I've done pretty well for myself here. I've built a pretty great kingdom, forgetting that God allowed him to be steward over a pretty great kingdom. Nebuchadnezzar was humbled by Almighty God. Pride goes before destruction. The Edomites were so filled with pride. We talked this morning in the sermon about submitting to God, and pride is what keeps people from submitting to God. Ultimately, if you are not submitting to God, you've got a pride problem. And it may be the biggest, toughest person in the world says, I'm not going to submit to anybody, and I'm just stubborn enough that even if you beat me into submission, I'm still not going to own up to it and submit. There's coming a day when all will bow before King Jesus. Then it's going to be too late. Their pride cost them big time. Number 2, cruelty and hatred are punished. Getting back to Obadiah, if you look at verse 10, for thy violence against thy brother Jacob, shame shall cover thee, and thou shalt be cut off forever. Drop down to 15. For the day of the Lord is near upon all the heathen. As thou hast done, it shall be done unto thee. Thy reward shall return upon thine own head. For as ye have drunk upon my holy mountain, so shall all the heathen drink continually. Yea, they shall drink, and they shall swallow down, and they shall be as though they had not been. Their cruelty and their hatred are going to be punished. You see, this nation, these people, whether it's Babylon 586 or so, or whether it's earlier with the Philistines and the Arabs, they had come in and they had attacked, and Edom sat over on the other side, verse 11 says. Strangers carried away captive his forces, foreigners entered into his gates, cast lots, and it says, notice the end of verse 11, you were as one of them. You were just like one of them. You shouldn't have looked on the day of thy brother in the day that he became a stranger. Neither shouldest thou have rejoiced over the children of Judah in the day of their destruction. Neither shouldest thou have spoken proudly in the day of distress. Thou shouldest not have entered into the gate of my people in the day of their calamity. Yea, thou shouldest not have looked on their affliction in the day of their calamity, nor have laid hands on their substance in the day of their calamity. Neither shouldest thou have stood in the crossway to cut off those of his that did escape. Here are people that might have gotten away, and they stood in the way and blocked their way of escape. Neither shouldest thou have delivered up those of his that did remain in the day of distress. It's almost like they're saying to the enemy forces, whichever of those forces it might be, look over here. Here's one you missed. Get him. Make sure you don't miss this guy. You see the cruelty, the hatred? That really ties right in with the next lesson, number 3. You reap what you sow. We just read verses 15 and 16. It shall be done, as thou hast done in the middle of the verse, it shall be done unto thee. Thy reward shall return upon thine own head. As you've drunk upon my holy mountain, so shall all the heathen drink continually. You're going to reap what you've sown, Edom. Isn't that what Galatians 6, 7, and 8 tells us? Be not deceived. God is not mocked. Whatsoever a man soweth, that shall he also reap. He that soweth to the flesh shall of the flesh reap destruction. He that soweth to the Spirit shall of the Spirit reap life everlasting. God gives us freedom of choice. And sometimes people exercise that freedom of choice to live a very godless, worldly life. But you reap what you sow. And we need to remember that. Brother Moser used to tell us when I was in preacher school, I can't remember who it was, but there was a preacher, old-timey preacher, and he would preach a lesson from Romans 6:23 about the wages of sin is death. And he would say, payday someday. And he said sometimes he'd walk up and down the aisles, and he might turn and look you right in the eye and stand 2 feet from you, and he'd say, payday someday. But that's the idea, is that there is a day of reckoning. And that doesn't have to be a fearful thought. It's not necessarily meant to scare us into submission. It's just to get our attention. Remembering what Paul said in 2 Timothy 4, 6 through 8, there's a crown of life waiting for all those that love is appearing. Payday someday. It's not that we've earned it, but because we're in Christ Jesus, if we're faithful in him, that payday is a day to be something that we can look forward to very much. Doesn't have to be something that we dread, but we do reap what we sow. Whether good things, we'll reap. Bad things, though, we'll reap. Notice number 4, it's wrong to rejoice in others' misfortune. That's what really this book, in large part, is about, on top of their pride, is the fact that they stood there, even when they weren't attacking themselves, even though they didn't attack themselves, attack Judah, they stood there and watched and thought, isn't this great? You want a modern day example? Remember those of us who are old enough to remember 9/11 and the shots that they would show on television, cameras in the Middle East, recording folks. Many of them, they were so excited as the towers fell. And they've got their assault rifles and they're firing them into the air, just so happy to see the misfortune that has come to America. Now, even if the ideology those folks have is right, it's not. But even if it were, what a horrible attitude. But sometimes God's people can do that if we're not careful. Sometimes we'll say, somebody does us wrong, and we'll say, well, it's all right. He's going to get his. He's going to get his. I hope I'm around to see it. You ever said that? Or thought that? Or heard somebody say that? I hope I'm around when that comes full circle. It's wrong to rejoice at others' misfortune. We certainly don't want to just say, hey, that's okay, and act like somebody doing wrong is all right. But let's make sure we get our attitudes right. Back to the book of Proverbs, Proverbs 17, verse 5. Notice what the wise man says. Whoso mocketh the poor reproacheth his maker, and he that is glad at calamities shall not be unpunished. Going over to chapter 24. Interesting statement here, 24, 17, and 18. Rejoice not when thine enemy falleth, and let not thine heart be glad when he stumbleth, lest the Lord see it, and it displease him, and he turn away his wrath from him. In other words, you're sitting over there, you're laughing so hard at that fellow's misfortune, understanding personifying God in the sense and for illustrating purposes. But, it'd be like picking on somebody over here and, you're dealing with them, maybe a parent situation. Maybe that's a better way to illustrate it. Here's a child who's done wrong and is being punished. Maybe the other child's over there going, I've been waiting all day to see you get a good whooping. And Dad says what? You laugh so loud, you got Dad's attention. And Dad says, you think that's funny? My mom would sometimes say, you're going to be laughing out of the other side of your mouth. I don't know what that meant literally, but I know what it meant figuratively, and it was not good. It was never good when you start laughing out of the other side of your mouth. Don't rejoice at other people's calamity. Jesus said, treat others how you want to be treated. That's basically the golden rule, right? Matthew 7:12. In Matthew 5:43-48, he talks about love your enemies. Pray for those who do you wrong. Someone smites you on the right cheek, turn your left also. We don't rejoice and say, well, he's going to get what's coming to him, and I hope I'm there to see it. What an awful attitude. It's tempting to have that attitude. We got to fight that. That's a lesson we learn from this book. Next, human defenses are useless when God has set his face against you. God says in verses 3 and 4, you dwell in the clefts of the rock. That was a very good defense. That was a very good location. God says, but it's not going to protect you from me. Your number's up, Edom. And no matter what defenses you have, they will not do any good. Look at verse 7. All the men of thy confederacy have brought thee even to the border. The men that were at peace with thee have deceived thee and prevailed against thee. They that eat thy bread have laid a wound unto thee. There is none understanding in him. Oh, they had allies. They had treaties and confederacies. God says, who's going to save you from me, Jehovah Almighty God? No one could save them. They missed their chance to humble themselves and submit to God. And he says, now it's payday. You're going to reap what you've sown. Psalm 46:1 says, God, not allies, not confederacies and things like that. God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble. Notice next, God controls the nation's destinies. We learn that in this book. Daniel 4:32, the Most High ruleth in the kingdoms of men, and giveth it to whomsoever he will. You and I, whatever blessings we have, we're just stewards. I don't own anything. Nebuchadnezzar thought he owned that kingdom. He thought he had done all that. And God says, you're going to learn. And then finally, we learn from the book of Obadiah that failure to do good is a sin. We notice this, really, it just begins in verse 11. They stood on the other side, and he says, you were like one of them. It sort of reminds me, in a way, of the Good Samaritan, the parable that Jesus told. The Levite and the priest, and they came by, and, I forget the brother that he had the expressions, the passing priest. He passed by. And then the looking Levite. The Levite looked. Neither one of them helped. Now, they might stand there and they say, hold on now, look, I didn't beat that guy up. I didn't lay a hand on him. How could you possibly say I'm in the wrong in any way, shape, form, or fashion? And Jesus says, because you didn't do what you knew you should have done and what was in your power to do. Here's Edom, and they might say, we never lifted a finger trying to hurt anybody in Judah, Lord. I didn't swing a sword. I didn't hurt anybody. I just moved out of the way so that fella couldn't hide behind me. I just happened to be standing in the way as he was fleeing. It slowed him down and he got captured. James 4:17 is very clear. Therefore, to him that knoweth to do good and doeth it not, to him it is sin. Failure to do good is sin. This little book packs a powerful punch. There's a lot we can learn from it. I think the two big lessons for me, it's hard to pick out pick out the absolute number one or two biggest lessons. But for me personally, I think the two biggest lessons, and I put them in that order for a reason, is number one and the last one there. Pride and failure to do what is right. Because so often pride gets us thinking that I can just do whatever I want. And I don't have to do what is right. I don't have to submit to God. That kind of thinking is the thinking of a fool. And on the day of judgment, it'll be too late to change that kind of thinking. If your life's not right with the Lord, maybe you need to become a Christian. You can come confess Jesus Christ, submit to Him, give your life to Him, be immersed in water to have your sins washed away by the blood of the Lamb. The Lord will add you to His church. But you've got to submit to His authority. Brothers and sisters in Christ, are we submitting to His authority? You wait till the day of judgment to bow the knee, and it's too late. Learn from Edom. Pride goes before destruction. Don't put off what you know is right. Don't fail to do what is right. Don't just stand from a distance and say, well, I didn't do anything. One time we got in the car going somewhere. My mom reached back and she let me have it. Out of nowhere. I said, what's that for? I didn't do anything. She said, absolutely. That's what that was for. She had told me to do something, and I didn't do it. And so my first reaction was, I didn't do anything. She said, bingo. Don't wait until the day of judgment when God is dealing out punishment and try to say, whoa, I didn't do anything, and have God say, absolutely. And that's the problem. If you need to make your life right with the Lord, won't you come as we stand and sing?